Antarctica. You think ice? Maybe penguins?
Yeah,
But probably not dinosaurs.
exactly. But they were there.
Yeah.
And the very first one discovered on that now frozen continent was Antarctopelta, an armored herbivore.
Wow. Antarctopelta.
And what's so fascinating isn't just, finding a dinosaur in Antarctica. It's that its existence opens up this view onto a completely different ancient world.
Right.
And it makes us ask big questions about how dinosaurs evolved, especially in the southern hemisphere.
So today, we're doing a deep dive into Antarctopelta.
That's the plan. We'll look at the science, how it was found, where it fits in the family tree, which is actually quite debated.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, what it looked like, the world it lived in, and, the spot where they found it. It wasn't just Antarctopelta. There were hints of a whole rich ecosystem there.
Okay, so let's start at the very beginning then. How did this thing even come to light from under the ice?
Well, it all kicked off back in January 1986. Two Argentine geologists, Eduardo Olivero and Robert Scasso, they were out exploring James Ross Island. And that's when they stumbled upon these fragmented remains. An ankylosaur.
Just stumbled upon them.
Pretty much. But finding them was just the start. You think Antarctica now? It's tough. Back then, for excavation, brutal. The ground frost was relentless. So getting the bones out wasn't quick. It actually took them about 10 years on and off.
10 years, wow.
Yeah, chipping away at frozen earth for a decade. It really shows the dedication involved, especially in places like that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So what do they finally get after all that work?
What they uncovered is cataloged as MLP 86X281. And that specific specimen, that's the holotype.
The holotype, that's the main reference, right? The standard for the species.
Exactly. It's the benchmark for Antarctopelta oliveroi. And crucially, this was the first dinosaur found in Antarctica. Period. It really opened the door.
Okay, here's something I find really interesting, though. Found in 86. But it wasn't actually named until 2006.
That's right. The 20-year gap.
Why so long?
Well, science takes time. It was talked about in papers, kind of informally, but the official naming by paleontologists Leonardo Salgado and Zulma Gasparini didn't happen until 2006.
And that made it the second named Antarctic dinosaur.
Correct. After Cryolophosaurus, which was found later but named earlier in 93. So Antarctopelta's story had this really, really long incubation period, you could say.
A geological slow burn, definitely. What about the name itself, Antarctopelta?
It tells you a lot. Antarcto, from Antarctica, obviously, and pelta means shield in Greek.
Ah, like other armored dinosaurs.
Exactly. It's common for ankylosaurs. And the species name oliveroi. That's in honor of Eduardo Olivero.
The geologist who found it. Nice.
A well-deserved nod to his discovery and work there.
So after millions of years buried, then 10 years being dug out of the frost, what condition were these fossils actually in?
Pretty rough, honestly. The sources say heavily worn, quite fragmented. That freeze-thaw cycle is brutal on fossils.
I can imagine.
There was even a bit of confusion early on. They found a single toe bone, a phalanx, and thought maybe it belonged to a different animal altogether. But later analysis showed, nope, it likely belonged to the same individual. It just shows how tricky it is piecing things together from fragments.
For sure. And they found other things with it too, didn't they? Not just dinosaur bones.
That's right. Alongside the Antarctopelta bits, they found a tooth from a prehistoric shark, Notodonodon.
A shark?
Yeah, and some bivalve shells too, like clams.
Okay, so what does that tell us? Dinosaur, shark, shells.
It paints a picture. The thinking is the Antarctopelta died on land, its body washed out to sea. Maybe bloated and floated for a while.
Right, the bloat and float idea.
Exactly. And then out at sea, it likely got scavenged by sharks like Notodonodon before finally settling on the seabed where the bivalves lived. This isn't unique either. We find other ankylosaur fossils in marine sediments sometimes.
So a land dinosaur ending up buried at sea. Fascinating preservation. But okay, once they had these worn bones, figuring out where this Antarctic shield fit in the bigger dinosaur picture, that must have been tough.
Oh, definitely a puzzle. Initially, Antarctopelta showed this weird mix of features. Some characteristics looked like Nodosauridae.
Those are the ankylosaurs without tail clubs.
Correct. But other features seemed more like Ankylosauridae, the group with the famous tail clubs.
Huh. So it didn't fit neatly.
Not at all. Because of this confusing mix, it was first classified as Ankylosauria incerticetes.
Incerticetes. Uncertain placement.
Pretty much. It means of uncertain position. Like, we know it's an ankylosaur, but we're not sure exactly where it branches off within that big group. It was a bit of an evolutionary mystery guessed.
But things have gotten clearer since then, haven't they? Tell us about Parankylasauria. That sounds important.
It really is. This is a relatively new idea that shook things up. In 2021, scientists described this amazing, nearly complete ankylosaur skeleton from Chile. Its name is Stegoros.
Seguros, okay.
And Stegoros had some very unique features, especially in its tail armor, that seemed to link it to other ankylosaurs found only in the southern hemisphere. This led to the proposal of a whole new group, Parankylasauria.
A southern branch of the ankylosaur family.
Essentially, yes. A distinct evolutionary line that seems to have flourished down south.
And Antarctopelta is part of this group now.
That's the current thinking, yes. Parankylasauria now includes Antarctopelta from Antarctica, Stegoros from Chile, and also Coonbarosaurus from Australia.
Wow. Antarctica, South America, Australia.
Mm-hmm. And interestingly, Antarctopelta seems to be the largest of the known parankylosaurs so far.
How did they figure this out, placing it in this new group?
Through phylogenetic analysis, these are studies where scientists compare lots and lots of detailed anatomical features across different species to build evolutionary trees or cladograms.
Right.
Earlier analyses, like one in 2011, hinted Antarctopelta might be a primitive notosaurid, a basal one. But newer studies, in 2021 and even just this year, 2024, they strongly support placing it within Parankylasauria. So if you looked at that family tree visualization, you'd see Antarctopelta grouping closely with Stegoros and Coonbarosaurus, separate from the notosaurids and the main ankylosaurids. It tells a cool story about ankylosaur evolution taking different paths in the north and south.
That makes sense. So we know its relatives now. What about Antarctopelta itself? What did it actually look like? How big are we talking?
Well, based on the bones we have, the estimate is around 4 meters long, maybe a bit more. That's about 13 feet.
Okay, decent size.
Though paleontologist Gregory Paul, back in 2010, he suggested it might have been bigger, maybe closer to 6 meters or 20 feet, and weighing around 350 kilos, about 770 pounds.
A range then. What about its head and teeth? You mentioned ankylosaurs.
Right, typical ankylosaur fashion, it probably had a relatively small head, but its teeth were proportionally quite large and leaf-shaped, good for slicing vegetation.
Large teeth. Interesting for a plant eater. Anything special about them?
Yeah, they were asymmetrical. They had more little serrations called denticles on the side facing towards the front of the mouth, about 7 to 8 of them.
Okay.
And that number, 7 to 8, is actually the highest count we see in Parankylasauria. It helps distinguish it from Stegoros. The biggest tooth found is about 10 millimeters wide.
Huh. And how does that compare?
Well, interestingly, the much, much larger North American Ankylosaur euoplocephalus actually had smaller teeth on average.
Strange.
Yeah. And we have a piece of the lower jaw, and it shows the tooth row was curved like in other ankylosaurs. Probably helped with processing tough plants.
Gotcha. What about the rest of the skeleton? The backbone, the tail?
We have vertebrae from different areas, the neck bones, the cervicals. They were quite short and sort of circular in cross-section. Their length-to-height ratio is different, shorter than many other ankylosaurs.
Shorter neck bones, okay.
And the holes for the spinal cord, the neural canals, seem relatively larger compared to Stegoros. We also have fused vertebrae from the back and the hips, dorsals, and sacrals. That means it had a strong, stiff torso.
Right, typical for armored dinosaurs.
Exactly. Lots of rib fragments, too. And from the tail, we have about 8 vertebrae from the middle and the tip, and the ones right at the end, they show signs of ossified tendons.
Ossified tendons. Tendons turned to bone in the tail.
Running along the top and bottom, that suggests the tail tip was stiffened.
Uh-huh. So maybe pointing towards some kind of tail weapon.
Precisely. The shape of those very last tail vertebrae in Antarctopelta is remarkably similar to what we see in Stegoros.
The Chilean one.
Right. They're flattened, and they have this groove underneath. It's strong evidence that Antarctopelta, like Stegoros, had what is called a maquahuil at the end of its tail.
A maquahuil. What's that?
It's named after an Aztec weapon. Think of a flat, sort of paddle-like structure, but edged with sharp, bony plates, osteoderms fused together.
Whoa, so not a big round club like Ankylosaurus, but a flat, spiky paddle.
Exactly. A different kind of tail weapon, but probably still very effective for defense.
That's a really cool evolutionary twist. What about the legs and feet? Do we know much?
The limb bones are a bit more patchy. We have the lower end of a femur, the thigh bone. Based on that, the whole femur might have been around 30 centimeters long.
Okay.
And we have 5 metapodials. Those are the long bones in the hand or foot, plus 2 phalanges, the actual finger or toe bones.
So can we tell how many toes it had?
Well, looking at the more complete Stegoros, the guess is that Antarctopelta probably had 4 toes on its hind feet and maybe 4 fingers on its hands too. Some of those metapodials are quite slender, which might suggest they were foot bones, metatarsals. Maybe hints at a little agility, but, it was still an ankylosaur, not winning any races.
Huh, probably not.
Okay.
The main event for ankylosaurs, the armor. What did Antarctopeltas look like? Those osteoderms.
Right, the bony armor plates. We've actually identified at least 6 different types associated with the Antarctopelta skeleton.
These types.
Yeah, but here's the catch. Most were found loose, not attached to the skeleton. So figuring out exactly where each type went well, it's mostly educated guesswork.
Okay, what were the types?
Well, there was the broken base of what must have been a pretty big spike.
Ooh, spikes.
Then there were flat, sort of oblong plates. Those look a bit like the neck armor on the notosaurid Edmontonia. There were also large circular plates that had smaller bony bumps or nodules fused around the edge. These might have formed a shield over the hips, maybe something like what Sauropelta had.
A hip shield. Got it.
Then oval-shaped plates with a keel, a ridge down the middle. Some of these were actually found fused directly to ribs.
Oh, fused to the ribs.
Yeah, suggesting they probably ran in rows along its flanks, protecting the sides.
Makes sense.
And finally, lots and lots of small bony bumps called ossicles. These were probably scattered all over its skin in between the larger plates, filling in the gaps, like bony chainmail.
Wow, so spikes, plates, shields, nodules. A real mosaic.
Absolutely. And even the skull fragments found were heavily ossified, very thick bone.
Oh.
One piece, a supraorbital bone from above the eye, actually has a short spike sticking out sideways.
Armor everywhere.
Pretty much. We have other skull bits, too. Parts of the cheek, the back of the skull, but they're not as well preserved. It seems like it was very well protected by this combination of different armor styles.
A true Antarctic shield. So beyond the bones themselves, what about studying their microscopic structure? Can that tell us anything about how it lived?
Yeah, bone histology. There was a really interesting study in 2019 that looked closely at thin sections of the Antarctopelta bones.
Okay.
Well, initially, because some bones in the skeleton weren't fully fused, some researchers thought maybe the individual found was a juvenile, still growing.
Okay, that makes sense.
But this histology study looked at growth rings inside the bone, the texture of the bone tissue itself, samples from osteoderms, limb bones, ribs, even those ossified tendons. And the conclusion was that this particular Antarctopelta was actually sexually mature when it died. It was likely nearing its full adult size.
Ah, so not a youngster after all.
Nope. Fully grown or close to it. And interestingly, they also noted a small section of abnormal bone tissue in one sample. The significance of that isn't totally clear yet.
Okay, so it was mature. What about growth rate? Living way down south in Antarctica, even a warmer Antarctica, did that affect how fast it grew? You'd think the long, dark winters might slow things down.
That's a really good question, and something paleontologists wonder about for polar dinosaurs.
Yeah?
But the histologies suggested something surprising. Antarctopelta's growth rates seem to have been pretty similar to other ankylosaurs found living much closer to the equator at lower latitudes.
Really? No slowdown.
Apparently not significantly. It suggests that the late Cretaceous Antarctic environment, while different, didn't drastically alter its fundamental growth pattern compared to its relatives elsewhere.
Wow.
Which is interesting because we do see latitude affecting growth rates in some other dinosaur groups like hadrosaurs and ceratopsians. They seem to show slower growth in polar regions.
So Antarctopelta was maybe adapted differently.
It seems likely, maybe through metabolism, behavior, insulation. We don't know for sure, but its growth wasn't obviously hampered by the high latitude conditions.
Fascinating. Okay, let's really set the scene. Where exactly was this holotype found, and what was this ancient Antarctica like? You said warmer.
Right. The fossil came from the Snow Hill Island Formation, specifically a layer called the Gamma Member. This formation is one of only 2 main places in Antarctica we've found dinosaur fossils.
Okay.
And this layer dates to the Maastrichtian Age. That's the very end of the late Cretaceous period. And yes, climate-wise, totally different world, much warmer, much more humid globally. Antarctica was ice-free.
Ice-free Antarctica. It's still hard to wrap my head around. What grew there instead of ice?
Think dense forests, lots of conifers like pine trees, plus cycads, those palm-like plants, and ginkgo trees. A really green landscape.
Amazing.
But because it was still near the South Pole, geographically, it would have experienced extreme seasonality in day length. Long periods of darkness in winter, long periods of daylight in summer.
Right, the polar night and day.
Exactly. And remember, even though it was found in marine rocks,
It was a land animal.
absolutely, a terrestrial herbivore, like all ankylosaurs, that marine deposition is just where its body ended up after washing out to sea.
You mentioned connections to other places earlier. South America.
Yes. During the late Cretaceous, the Antarctic Peninsula, which includes James Ross Island, where Antarctopelta was found, was physically connected to the southern tip of South America.
A land bridge.
Right. So animals and plants could move between the two continents. And finding steguros in Chile, which is a close relative, a fellow parenchylosaur, that really strengthens the evidence for this connection and shows this group lived across both landmasses.
So it wasn't totally isolated down there. What else shared its specific environment in that gamma member layer?
We get quite a few clues. There are fossil wood fragments, twigs, leaves, sometimes found right with the Antarctopelta bones, probably washed out together.
Plant debris.
Yeah. And incredibly, they found fossil pollen grains from the Asteraceae family. That's the daisy and sunflower family.
Really? Daisies in the Cretaceous Antarctic.
Apparently. These are the oldest known fossils for that entire huge plant family. It's pretty amazing.
Wow.
There's also evidence from fossil spores suggesting parts of the landscape might have been quite wet, maybe peat bogs, things like sphagnum moss, club mosses, stuff like that.
Okay, so forests, maybe some bogs. What about other animals besides the shark that might have nibbled on it?
Well, from the same formation, the gamma member, we have fossils of another dinosaur, a small ornithopod called Trinosaura.
Another herbivore.
Yes. Also, a single vertebra from a huge titanosaurian sauropod, one of those long-necked giants.
Yo, sauropods too.
And then there's the marine life it would have been neighbors with offshore. Elasmosaurids, those long-necked plesiosaurs.
Uh-huh.
Big marine predators like the mosasaurus, tanosaurus, and hinosaurus. Various bony frames like Encodus. Other sharks besides Notodanodon like Sphenotis and Cretalomna. And ammonites, those coiled shell cephalopods.
So quite a crowd. A diverse ecosystem on land and sea.
Definitely. It paints this picture of Antarctopelta living in these cool, dark, forested Antarctic environments alongside other dinosaurs, while giant marine reptiles swam in the nearby oceans. So different from today.
It really is. Just imagining this armored dinosaur in a green Antarctica. Mind-blowing.
It is. So if we kind of wrap up this deep dive, what we've seen is Antarctopelta, the first Antarctic dinosaur discovery, an armored plant eater living in a surprisingly temperate world. It had this unique armor, possibly that flat, spiky macaroodle tail weapon like its relatives in South America. And its place in the family tree is clearer now within this distinct southern group, Parenchylosauria.
Yeah, that aha moment for me is definitely swapping the ice image for a forest, with this creature lumbering through it.
Exactly. And it leaves you thinking, doesn't it? We have these parenchylosaurs now confirmed in both Antarctica and South America. What does that really tell us about how dinosaurs spread and evolved across Gondwana as the continents were shifting?
Good question.
And maybe the biggest question, with so much of Antarctica still buried under kilometers of ice, what else is down there? What other amazing fossils are waiting to be found that could completely rewrite parts of Earth's ancient story?